So how do people even get jobs in this field? You could think, okay, is it because they're skilled at deconstructing the Christian religion? No. It's in service to largely the academic world that we call New Testament studies is in service to Western sacred history. They're custodians of that. They're custodians of that in so many ways. These texts were targeting the broader Mediterranean world. And that seems beyond dispute, really. But the problem is that there's little work being done to try and contextualize it within that world. And it's a giant wave. And to use the analogy, the Christians, they've got their surfboards out and they're riding the wave, but they're not the only ones on the wave. And it reinscribes the myth of the evolution of Western sacred history, that we evolved out of this orgy of madness because Christianity came on the scene. So I got to the point when I was writing it, I started, in my mind, I was having all of these arguments with all of the supposed leading scholars of our time. They were New Testament folks. And I got to the point where it was just maddening. I just thought, you know what? That's a waste. This is actually putting at risk the future. It's an existential threat by causal relation. It produces certain existential threats to our own species in some ways. To not have clarity on these issues is embarrassing.
Dr. Richard C. Miller is a transdisciplinary research scholar exploring the cultural and literal nexus between classical antiquity and the social origins of earliest Christianity. His published work focuses on the mythological roots of the New Testament gospel, portraitures of Jesus, the sacralized founding figure of the Christian religion. Miller undertook his graduate work at Talbot School of Theology, Masters of Divinity, Princeton Theological Seminary, Yale University, and Claremont Graduate University, where he got his Ph.D. This discussion is going to be very controversial. Your favorite Bible scholar might get dissed. Whether he's a liberal or conservative, we don't care. Are they correct? Are they bringing the sources? Are they looking at the data? We're going to talk about that in this video. Stay tuned.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today I'm with Richard C. Miller, and you just saw in the intro there, he's got some books available in the description. We're going to talk about that stuff. For example, like the one that we're discussing the most, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. Great book. And I just want to get right into the main thing that I want to discuss, and we're going to branch out in different directions when we start talking about this, is what is the cultural milieu that Christianity sort of comes out of. And it almost seems like there's one story that you get from tradition, and then there's another story when you look at the evidence, and they seem to not really, there's some overlap obviously, but there's something different going on there. And that's what I want to get into this about. Is Christianity just a pure offshoot of Judaism in its sense that it claims to be, or is there other cultural aspects in the broader Mediterranean world that are playing parts in this?
Yeah, I think probably I've thought about this question for quite a while, as you can imagine, having gone through my book there, and I am staking out a position with regard to that I feel very strongly about. So it's not an accident that you're asking me this question, Neil. I would first like to point out that I think there's a tendency going into this. I think it's a bias that comes into it, and it's mostly because where do people enter this discussion? Usually from a faith background, presented within certain contexts that are interested in training people within their religious kind of worldview, right? And so, from an academic standpoint, though, I think we need to make a distinction between the setting in the narrative, like say in the Gospels. What's the setting? Well, it's Palestine, it's Judea, it's Jerusalem, it's Galilee, it's Samaria, it's these places, right? And the literary context, well, that's the area where you get all of the cultural fabric, the linguistic content that's going into this. Who are the readers, and what's their world that they're living in? What are they swimming in, linguistically, culturally? And those are two very different questions, but they get conflated heavily in New Testament scholarship. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, and we can get into that in this interview. I know we want to hit on that further in the discussion here, but just enough to say that these texts were targeting the broader Mediterranean world, and that seems beyond dispute, really. But the problem is that there's little work being done to try and contextualize it within that world, and so there's a sense of trying to sequester it off into Judaism and to see Judaism as if early Christianity were a sect of Judaism, and as if Judaism itself were somehow siloed off culturally from the rest of the broader Mediterranean world at that time.
That's such a good point that I want to highlight that, because this is where I think this is where the problem starts. Judaism as a religion, it develops just like every other religion does, just like every other cultural entity or association or ecclesia, whatever you want, whatever, all these different associations, Orphism, Pythagoreanism, Platonism, paganism, whatever that means, like the local mystery cults and all that stuff. And over in Jerusalem, you have another development, and we call it Judaism today. But this comes out of the same Mediterranean, or I should say, in the broader Middle Eastern world, going towards like the Babylonians, and they're drawing from all the same cultural milieus. And it's the same process happening, just in this part of the world. So I think the biggest mistake we make is we draw a border around Israel and say, that's monotheism, that's Judaism, and everyone else is pagan. And There's a dichotomy, and it's so wrong to say that. No, by the way, no one called themselves pagans. No one. That's like a derogatory term that happens later. It means like hillbilly. It means like you're a hillbilly. You're not educated. You don't know the Christian faith. You're an idiot. You're a pagan. That's not, paganism doesn't exist. It's just you have these different cults in different cities, different priesthoods, and they're all drawing from the same cultural stuff. They all do the same bull sacrifices. They all do the same lamb sacrifices. They all do the same type of oracle systems, and they all have like temples built the same way. It's all this. It's like there really is no division happening. So I wanted to highlight that, and I'll let you continue on what you're saying.
Well, yeah. So under the stress, within the crucible of, say, the Maccabean period, that's when you get the different sects of Judaism arising, and it starts to fragment or fracture out into all of these different kind of manifestations or brands or types or permutations.
And let me say something about that too. People get mad when I cut off people, but this is such a big thing right here, because yes, in the Maccabean period, you're seeing them push themselves away from the broader Hellenization world, even though they're all named, even though they all have Hellenized names, like Jason Maccabees. But let's put that aside for now. Let's say, okay, they reject all these other cults. Well, so have you read Plato? Plato's Republic, where he says all these different Homeric and Hesiod themes are teaching children to be bad people, and we need a better, more up to date type of religion. And then even beyond Platonism, even beyond the philosophical sects, in Rome in 186 BCE, they were horrified at the Bacchic priesthoods that were surrounding Rome, and they outlawed the Bacchic cult. And by the way, Maccabees, the god that they're going up against is Dionysus, specifically. I think Zeus too. But they were talking about the Dionysian procession coming in from Antiochus. So to me, that's no different than the Romans outlawing Bacchus. And what's the difference there? There's no difference to me. So I think it becomes, what happens is they're all drawn from the same cultural stuff. But then once you become your own priesthood, your own entity, that's when you take on an individual role and say it's us versus them type of thing. But that's not to say that they're like from a different planet, or they have a force field around them, and that they can't they can't draw from these other cultural ideas. That's, and I just wanted to point that out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. So you have Alexander's conquests to the east, right? And you have the different kingdoms that split off from that. That you've got, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, etc. And so the Seleucid Empire is basically that's occupying the region that we would consider to be the stomping ground of the New Testament later under Roman governance. But prior to that, it was, and that's where you get Antiochus Epiphanes and the story in 2 Maccabees about the martyrs and their resistance to the tyrant. It's calls him the tyrant multiple times. That's a political resistance largely. When you get to the Pharisees, they're described even in the New Testament as having embraced a lot of Persian ideas. You've got demons and apocalypse and resurrection and angels and all sorts of things that would be occultic in some ways to a pure kind of idea that rising out of classical Hebrew tradition. And so they're more open-minded, a lot more actually. In fact, that's kind of the banner under which they're marching in some ways. Is that's their posture to all of that. There's the temple that continues to be contested through that period, and so the Maccabean literature haven't written it. We have it in Greek, right? That should say enough right there. What's going on? But there's a tendency to want to convert the temple in Jerusalem to a temple that conflates the 2 deities, Zeus and Yahweh. They're both mountain deities, the sky deities that are kind of principal in those different cultures, and to try and see the and if you read against the grain in the Maccabean literature, there was a massive resistance within Judaism against those that were resisting Hellenization, and so there was pro and there were those that were in favor and those that were against that, and some of them wanted to have their city revamped and with porticos and colonnades and all of the gymnasia and all of the niceties of a modern Greek city. They wanted that for their own people, and understandably, and they were open-minded to the idea of syncretizing with classical Greek or Hellenistic, even religious forms, even seeing Zeus and Yahweh as synonymous to that extent. And in fact, in Samaria, it succeeds. That temple, if you go back and actually read the Maccabean literature, that the temple where Jesus was also Messiah, when he went to the woman at the well and all of that, he was their Messiah too. Their temple was dedicated to Zeus, Yahweh.
Yeah, and Demetrius Philarium, when he wrote that letter to I forgot who it was, the high priest, I think it was the high priest. He says, "Yeah, we call him Zeus, you call him whatever." I think he says Yahweh. I can't remember, but it's the letter that Josephus relates, and it's right before they do the Septuagint translation. He's saying, "Yeah, your laws are very, very noble and very divine, and we're all the same. We're all in the same boat. Zeus, we call him life. Xena, we call him the same as you guys." And so you can see that sort of thing happening. And another thing, and you mentioned the gymnasium as an abomination mentioned in Maccabees, but Plato's laws specifically call out gymnasiums as being places where evil happens and children or homosexuality comes, like all this. He sort of like says we need to get rid of these gymnasiums, or we should have them, but they should be really regulated, some sort of thing like that. And it's like there's a prime example. You can see this is something that's developing across the board, where people are. It's like this sort of movement of piety, I call it, like where people are sort of growing out of the orgay, the orgia religions of the ancient world, because those are pretty prominent in some of these Bacchic sects. But it's not just Judaism that's doing this. It's all across the board. You're seeing the Orphics, you're seeing the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, and they're all sort of adopting this. Well, we should be humble and pious, and we should reject the bodily pleasures, And this is sort of a movement it's happening just across the board in general. I don't see it just happening in one space.
Yes, the early Christians did not define that. That's the ascetical ascesis. You might want to, that's one way to describe it. And it comes out of the philosophical tradition. It's a giant wave. And to use the analogy, the Christians, they've got their surfboards out and they're riding the wave, but they're not the only ones on the wave. They're not defining the wave. They are, in some ways, taking it to certain extremes through certain manifestations like martyrdom and these kind of things. But they're not even unique in that. And so, ascetical kind of a disposition had become very popular. In fact, Veronica Grimm, under whom I studied on the East Coast there, she wrote a book, From Feasting to Fasting, and it basically traces that trajectory from the Homeric period all the way into late antiquity, where attitudes regarding self-discipline and constraint, self-restraint, austerity, fasting, and be a manifestation of that. But it's shown in all sorts of ways, and it largely is falling from the classical philosophical traditions. And so there's a kind of a polarity there that's going on between they're criticizing, the philosophers are criticizing a lot of the classical mythological forms, and the indulgence of Zeus is just all they're becoming critics in some ways of that, and of course trying to thread that line carefully not to get themselves into too much trouble. But that's where they're coming from in that, and Christianity arises within that and is itself a product of that larger conversation and contestation that's going on in antiquity.
This is what I want to get into, because this is as someone who's not an expert, I'm just a big nerd, and I love reading about this stuff. As in the same way a nerd of Star Wars would get mad about the new Star Wars movie not being politically correct compared to like the canon or whatever, I can sort of relate to that as like someone who's really nerdy about ancient history and mythology and religions. Whereas I'm thinking, why aren't some of these areas of study being focused on more by New Testament scholarship? I'm only seeing it in classicists and specific like Egyptologists or Thraciologists that study the origin of Thrace. And I brought up Thraciologists because there's a scholar, Ruja Popova, and Ph.D. at the Institute of Balkan Studies and Center of Thraciology. And this person writing all these articles about this religion coming from the Hellenistic region, from the 4th century BC all through the 1st century, even beyond that. These Hypsisterian people who are worshiping the God Most High, and they don't care about circumcision or the Mosaic laws, but they mingle with Jews. Like there's evidence that they're friendly with the Jews. They like them. They like their scriptures a little bit, but they're not like we don't care about circumcision. We don't have images of God. We just worship God, and he's just like this. He's just like this idea, and it's almost like the Platonist God coming forth in this religion. And then you have them. Then I find out in these inscriptions, they call themselves Sebomenoi or Theosebes, God-fearers. This is what they call themselves. The titles they have. These are the people that Paul are writing to in his letters. And not even that, Sebomenoi is who he addresses in the narrative of Acts. So whoever wrote that is making Paul address them in that narrative. So I'm thinking now, doesn't necessarily mean they are Hypsisterians, but what I'm gathering is that at the very least there's a overlap between the cultural religious attitudes of Thrace and Phrygia, modern day Turkey. By the way, where Christianity explodes, where the Church of Constantinople is. This is where they moved the capital. This is where the church fathers of Bithynia, that little area of Bithynia, that's the first time Christianity is mentioned by Pliny the Younger. So we're talking about Christianity seems like more of a development of northern Turkey, southern Thrace than it is for Israel.
Yes.
And this is my concern. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Why is it that people are I don't know, maybe they are, maybe I'm just not seeing it, but why doesn't it seem like we're not looking at the developments in this region and how they come out of this region rather than trying to see it as like this Jewish offshoot?
Yeah, that's all great question. Well, first off, I think with all the people you've been talking to on your show, great show, by the way, Neil. You've had some of the top world experts on here. I'm honored to be a guest. Um, we all probably need to get together and award you with like an honorary doctorate or something like that. You know much or more than many of the people that claim to know so much in our field, and so just a little, yeah. Yeah, no, it's great to have a conversation. You could run with the best in these conversations, and so it's more than just a Star Wars fan at this point. I think for you, um, yeah. So I think you're absolutely correct. Why aren't we studying the hell out of Bithynia? Why aren't we studying the hell out of Macedonia and Rome and the cultural hubs where this religion caught fire and just ignited? Why aren't those largely rejected in Jerusalem? Judaism largely unaffected by the rise of Christianity. You could make a case to the contrary, but it'd be pretty puny and scanty that Judaism was largely, had the rise of Christianity had this massive impact on Judaism. It absolutely was. It was a full scale cultural revolution, though, in the Greco-Roman world. That's where these texts are getting traction. That's where they're being marketed. That's where they're being written. That's where they're being consumed. That's where the religion is taking off. That's where these texts are targeting those contexts and are the earliest evidence. When you look at Paul, where's he at? Is he hanging out writing stuff in Hebrew in Jerusalem? No, he's almost indistinguishable from like an itinerant philosopher in his own right, almost like I don't know, an occultic Middle Platonist kind of running around with his own cultic conceptions, largely untethered to Judaism. He doesn't not see himself, and the earliest Christians are abrogating. They're giving up nearly every separatist practice that Judaism had claimed at that time. They're giving up circumcision. They're giving up, eating separately. They're giving up. You go down the list, and part of the gist or even importance of this literature is that letting go of each one of those pieces, right? And that the mission has shifted to the Gentiles, so to speak, the nations, the ethne. And so that's the narrative that's going on early on, and then in the earliest evidence of the Christian tradition or traditions. And so that should be what we're studying. And it's written; these are texts that are written in Greek, that are playing on and riffing on and trying to create their own adaptations of within the larger Hellenistic world. And this isn't unique to Christianity. If you go down to Egypt, they're doing the same thing at like Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt. They've got their own Hellenistic forms that are built on top of their more ancient forms there. If you go to Palmyra or Edessa or any of these other places where Christianity also took off, these are also syncretic areas where you'll find all sorts of amalgams between those different the cultural hardware that was available at the time. And Christianity, as it took off in other directions, like say Nestorianism or Manichaeanism, highly syncretic. These are traditions of Christianity that ventured out into the East and flourished there. Not and and those are highly syncretic that are that are hybrid with traditions in those directions, like for instance Buddhism. If you go to Manichaeanism, it's got Buddhist ideas in it, it's got Indic ideas in it, it's got Persian ideas in it, and Parthian and so forth. And so you've got the tradition that's going toward Rome. That's the one that we have mostly preserved, at least in evidence in our New Testament. And lo and behold, it is syncretic toward the classical Greco-Roman forms in the Roman Hellenistic period. And so that's the bedrock underneath this. And that's the hardware on which this software is being ran, so to speak. If you want to look at that as an analogy, the New Testament, the earliest Christian cult that's preserved in that trajectory toward Rome, that's software that's running on the classical Mediterranean hardware at the time. This is people that were in Corinth. Were they deeply steeped in Judaism? No, no. Even when I brought this up in a separate interview, but when you look at uh, the first major successful gospel, if we want to call it that, Mark, if you dig in there, the Jews are mentioned in the third person and they're criticized throughout the text in so many ways, right? And this is not a flattering picture of Judaism at the time. For the most part, it's a fairly scathing critique across it in many ways. Now, in some,
Even Matthew gets sort of labeled as the most Jewish of all, but even Matthew is kind of picking on the Jews a little bit. And you also have Magi following a star,
right,
right? That's not Jewish. Like, so I even the most Jewish gospel of all has some problems with it. And then you look at, like, what are the Jews saying about Christianity? They don't look. If you read some of these Mishnah texts, they're not very friendly towards the Christians either. So there's like the evidence just shows there's friction there. They're not overlapping, and they're not like friendly with each other. They don't even consider the Christians as fellow Jews, I don't think.
right. Now, obviously, we would see Paul as coming out of Judaism and other early cult leaders and founders and stuff in some way. But also early on, you see a lot of others that are jumping in, and some of the writers, even in the New Testament. Who's Luke? Was that a devout Jew from Jerusalem? I don't think so. And I don't think Mark was either. It was a traveling companion that jumped in later. Um, again, he describes them in the third person, um, and then has to explain Judaism in these glosses throughout the text. Like he stops at one point and he says, "Oh, and by the way, the Jews, when they eat, they need to wash their pots and pans." And make sure and follow their purity practice, because that's what they, and he's giving this you don't have to describe that to Jewish people, and that borders on an insult to them. If this is a text primarily targeting Jewish people, that's absurd. Like, that'd be like trying, like I said on Derek's channel, that would be like trying to describe a football to professional football players. Like, it's a ridiculous. Like,
And it seems like, but I think we do have to mention that they are obviously drawing from Old Testament narratives, and they're sort of making Jesus fulfill a lot of the stuff happening throughout not just the Torah, but like even the prophets and stuff in Isaiah. And they're taking all these themes from Isaiah and from Zechariah and from Moses and the story of Moses and Abraham, and they're sort of putting it on the Jesus. But that comes through the Septuagint, if I'm not mistaken. There's no evidence that they're really using anything from the Hebrew side. It's almost like it seems like they're pretty much just drawing from the Septuagint, which is a Greek text.
yeah, and I would go even further than that. Is they're spoon feeding that to their readers as if the readers weren't really steeped in it. And they have to like lead them into these texts, into these kind of interpretations that they're giving, which we could get into just how valid some of those interpretations are, like the messianism that's in the New Testament, largely not embraced. A lot of those concepts are not embraced in Judaism, but that's the way that they want to draw it up. That's the form within the cult. And this is the way it's being fed to early converts out in the far-flung empire in places like Corinth and Ephesus, highly Hellenistic cities. Hellenism was rampant in these cities, and these were it's almost like in New Testament studies, it's supposed that the early converts were dropped in from some unimaginably alien place, and we're just finding all of this completely befuddling, like, wow, what are all these people doing? No, they had been swimming in this for generations. These were the people that lived in these cities, and Hellenism was the way of it. And so it wasn't a decision. It wasn't Jewish or Hellenism. It was Jews were variously also dedicated to Hellenism, so it wasn't a dichotomy.
let me jump in on that for a second, because I think a good example that gives us a big picture of what some of these more Hellenized Jews were thinking is Philo of Alexandria, and he explicitly says, all right, so this is the this works now. I'm gonna to admit I'm gonna tweak one of the words he has here. I think I would translate it differently. He uses the word logos. He translates it as reason, but I'm gonna change it back to logos because I think I want people to hear it for what it sounds like in the Greek. It's Philo. It's called On Creation. If people want to look this up, On Creation X36. He says the incorporeal world. This is very Platonist. When you hear that incorporeal, this is all Plato loves these type of language, by the way. So already off the bat, when you hear the word incorporeal, you're like, okay, Plato. You're thinking of Platonism. Incorporeal world was already completed, having its seat in the divine logos, and the world, perceptible by the external senses, was made on the model of it, and the first portion of it, being also the most excellent of all, made by the Creator, was the heaven, which he truly called the firmament, as being corporeal for the body, is by nature firm, insomuch it is divisible into three parts, and whatever the other idea of solidity and of body can there be, except that it is something which may be measured in every direction. Therefore he, very naturally contrasting that was perceptible to the external senses in the corporeal with that which was perceptible by the intellect and the incorporeal, calls this the firmament. Now, if you read that, if the way he translates, he says divine reason, which it's a correct reason, logos. I guess you could say that, but I would have kept the word logos, because now all of a sudden you're like, wait, God's creating the world, incorporeal and incorporeal, through his logos. That's what it sounds like. It almost sounds like something that maybe John might be drawing from this, or something similar. Maybe if it's not Philo, maybe this idea is floating around in the world, in the Hellenized Jewish world. And this is very Platonist, by the way, incorporeal and corporeal. By the way, there's another passage in here where he says the three parts are incorporeal, corporeal, and spiritual. And you're like, that has so much Trinitarian stuff floating around in that sentence. Because like corporeal, which is flesh, incorporeal, the Father, and then spiritual, the Holy Spirit. Like, you're like, what is this where this Trinity comes from? I'm just like throwing ideas out there. I could be wrong. I don't know. But the reason why I wanted to bring this part up is because here's a prime example of a Jewish philosopher he's completely Jewish to the core. No doubt about it. He loves Moses. He loves the laws. He loves Abraham. Read Philo. It's Jewish. He's not a pagan or whatever you want to call it. But he's also very Platonist. He loves Plato. He says Plato is divinely inspired in this book. So this is a prime example. Somebody living in Alexandria who's writing in Greek, who's relating Jewish ideas, but through the Hellenistic philosophy lens of Middle Platonism and Stoicism.
Well, that's exactly you described it to a T. That's exactly what's going on there. He's creating a fashionable kind of rendition of, he's revamping Judaism in some ways within the structures of the philosophical world of that time, presenting himself as a sort of Jewish philosopher that's on the par with, or at least could have respectability within that context. Alexandria was a major center. It rivaled Athens in terms of its philosophical schools and sophistication and reputation. And Judaism, in that context, I know there were different forms, obviously, but he represents, in some ways, the height of that, at least in terms of one writer that survives from that time, one thinker. And yeah, he is bringing forward. He's drawing on the classical philosophical tradition, and in many ways showing his religion to be sophisticated and able to be conveyed through that lens, as you described it. The demiurgos and the Timaeus and Plato's Timaeus. First, one thing that's missing is, maybe we need to take all of Plato's works and just glue them onto the bottom of our New Testament or something like that, just so everyone knows.
I've been saying that.
significant and important and defining those works were to the psyche and the intellectual, the kind of the top thinkers of that time, and the earliest Christians.
I'm actually surprised that New Testament, like seminarians, don't have to read Plato or Greek at all. That you would think this would be mandatory. Understand Christianity. I mean, it's like imagine trying to understand economics and not doing math.
Right. Exactly. You know,
we're talking
all
about
of them, actually, not even just Plato, but all of them. I mean, if you go over to they should also glue Homer to the bottom of everyone's news. Every convert to this religion knew the works of Homer. They might not have known it, you know, verbatim as a memorized text, but they were steeped in it, and they were immersed in this, just like you spoke of Star Wars earlier. This was so much more important to them than our Star Wars, and so the idea that we're not studying the literary world of the ancient mind, that the earliest converts that were coming into this, how were they thinking when they came into this religion? It's almost like it's thought that somebody just erased the entire hard drive and you know, put Christianity on there, and that's just not how human beings work.
It's not how any culture works.
Yeah, it's not realistic. And so Euripides would be another one that is just towering canonical. Hesiod, another one, towering canonical set of texts that come from his works there, Works and Days and Theogony. Those should all be required reading for anyone that claims to be delving into,
especially theology. As if you're a theology degree, Ph.D. in theology, you should have to know this stuff. I think, just personally, I think it's like I don't think I'm asking too much, because theology is a Greek word that comes from the Platonists. The first theologian was Orpheus. He was called Orpheus the theologian, and by the way, he was also called an apocalypse, a revealer. So you have all this terminology that you get in Christianity coming from the Orphic Platonist world. And like how many people who have PhDs in theology don't even know that? Don't even know what your degree means. It's like, no offense, but like not to
No, it is. It's absurd. You kind of wonder, what are they studying? You know, I brought this up. I've brought this up many times, actually. That's part of the whole reason. It's the discursive constraints is one. I've got a section in the book where I explore that, and that's part of the scandal of this whole field. Really, is the arbitrary lines and walls that have been built up. They're relics. They're leftovers from a Christian medieval scholastic kind of world that dominated. That's where we get our whole Western academic kind of structure, is out of that world. And in some ways, the modern discourse in New Testament studies, I hate to say it, but it really is almost the last holdout of the Dark Ages in some ways, in terms of trying to investigate these things with the kind of rigor that we would place on any other subject matter. Secular academics have not been governing this discourse. We're not defining it. We are not in control of kind of the primary description of what early Christianity was and how it got off the ground. We are at best marginal voices that are drawn into question often. It's almost suspicious. We're seen as we must be up to something. You know, we must.
I've heard classes when I bring up New Testament studies, and they just go, whatever. Like, all right, let's talk about it. Almost like this, it's like something. I don't know. I don't even want to get it. I'm not going to be rude, but anyways, because there's some brilliant New Testament scholars out there, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm like I'm better than anybody. I'm not. I'm just some random guy. I'm just pointing out what I'm noticing. Okay, but this is some of the stuff that frustrates me. And you mentioned there's these dogmas that are very present in biblical scholarship. And one of those is like this like allergic knee-jerk reaction to anybody trying to draw from the outside. To them, it's outside the broader Mediterranean world. And they're like, for example, Dennis McDonald. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, Dennis McDonald is parallelomania, and I'll say, oh, so which of his books did you read? Well, I didn't read it. I just heard that. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say this. I'm not going to drop names here, but people, some of these people listening right now are going to know that I'm talking about them because I've had these conversations with them and said, Dennis McDonald's parallelomania. Oh, really? So you know Greek, you've read Homer, you've read Hesiod, you've read Euripides, you've read Aeschylus, and you've read Dennis's books, and now you what's your? Let me hear why Dennis is. Well, I haven't even read any of that stuff. This is just what I've heard.
Yeah.
But why would you even say that? Just say you don't know if Dennis is correct. I have to look into it. Wouldn't that be the correct thing to do? Wouldn't that be the rigorous, honest thing to say? Hey, I heard Dennis's book goes a little far, but me personally, I don't know Homer. I don't know Euripides, Bacchae. I don't even know Greek, so I'm not going to weigh in on that. I'm just telling you what I heard. And I'm like, okay, I respect that answer. But the first thing he said was, it's parallelomania. Christianity is a niche religion, man. That's what he said. And I've heard, and it's not just I've heard this from like 5 different New Testament scholars that I've talked to. They're saying Dennis is Now, I'm not saying Dennis is like omniscient and everyone needs to like bow to his work and like know his stuff. But I am saying like at least know the material that he's coming from. And he points out some of the stuff that he points out that's indisputable, in my opinion, is the practice of you training people to learn Greek by copying Homer and Euripides. So he points out, look, the people who wrote the Gospels, most likely, better chance than not, were trained in learning the classics like Homer and Euripides.
That's right. That's right. It's for lack of training in that field. It's mostly people having so how do people even get jobs in this field? You could just back off of the whole thing and think, okay, is it because they're skilled at deconstructing the Christian religion? Is that how you become successful in this field? And no, it's in service to largely the academic world that we call New Testament studies is in service to Western sacred history. They're custodians of that. They're custodians of that in so many ways. And so, and I say them because I don't want to even. I pride myself on my intellectual honesty, and you really do have to go back and study all of that to even draw a conclusion that's worth listening to. You'd have to go back and actually take a deep immersive study of the canonicity of Homer in antiquity, just how important mimesis was in the writing policies of the time. This was standard for people to imitate Homer in their narratives was standard. This isn't just Dennis McDonald off on the side having some kind of quack theory. This is as the result of an entire field neglecting the literary world of antiquity.
Yeah. And John, the way John is written is like, I don't know how you can't come away with it as a tragedy.
Right.
The way it's written, the way the characters are presented, the sequence of events, all the stuff that lines up with other tragedies, and so does John. It fits like just like any other tragedy does.
You could almost take, I mean, here's one way to look at it. You could almost take, if you were to say, let's take a project here. If you were to take, say, the Elisha cycle in classical Hebrew tradition, those stories of the healings and going about in the axe head and all that stuff. If you were to take that, just the kind of episodic vignettes that are in that, and say put in a bowl and mix that with Homer. Just mix all that together into one kind of gumbo. You would get something that is in pretty close proximity to the Gospels.
Right.
If you got to that point. Now, I'm not saying that explains the entire thing, but just that ought to be telling all in its own right, that you've got, and you're right. No one has very, very few in our field have sat down with Dennis's work and actually read what he's written there. It's compelling. There, you can't.
I think he's too careful. Like me personally, I would go farther than he goes. He's very careful on things that he presents as what you would say speculation or his hypotheses. He's not just throwing out stuff at the wall to see what sticks. Me and him have talked on the phone, and I would say, well, what about this passage that like sounds like this or whatever? And he'll go, I think you're being too speculative. He's way more careful than people give him credit for. He really is.
It's true. It's true. Now, I did my PhD under him, and he's a fantastic mentor, and he guided me in a wonderful way. And he's still somebody that guides me. I still have breakfast with him frequently. We live in the same community here in the greater LA area in Claremont, near the colleges here. And I have a lot of wonderful conversations with him. He is one of those people that has made a profound and really fundamental, radical contribution to this field that goes still undiscovered. And it's mostly because of these dynamics. Paganism. What is paganism? Why are we even using that term at this point? It's an anachronism for earliest Christianity. No one was talking about the earliest Christians as pagans at that time, or outside of the early Christians being pagans at that time. It should never be used in an academic setting any more than the hick or any other derogatory word, the N word. I don't mean to bring that into this, but it's a nasty word that's meant to create aversion, and it reinscribes the myth of the evolution of Western sacred history, that we evolved out of this like orgy of madness because Christianity came on the scene.
Right. Which is so false.
Right. And
yeah. That's you're so right though. That's the impression you get from a lot of people in the New Testament studies realm, is that there's the Greek pagan world, and they're all worshiping idols and sacrificing goats, and just ignore that happens in the Old Testament. Forget about that stuff. It's only them doing it, right? But then they go even farther, and it's like there's this separate border across the pagans and these pious Christians these poor people were persecuted by these Romans that were worshiping Caesar, and it's like it's way more. They're simplifying it so much that it sounds like a fairy tale. And,
right.
And when you use that word pagan, what you're doing is you just jumped into a dogma, and now as soon as you use that word to describe the other, what you've done is you've limited yourself to understand the broader Mediterranean world, and now you're operating within a dogma that was created by the church in later times. So you're all, without even realizing it, you're now operating within the dogmas of the church, even if you don't even want to. You are.
Right. And that's, this happens elsewhere as well. You can go into, who were the barbarians,
right.
Like the victor rarely gets to paint the vanquished rarely get to paint the picture of their own history, right? It's written by others. And strangely enough, you can go back, the literary evidence for the Roman world is giant. You go back and read some of these people. Brilliant. Go read Cicero, Go read Virgil, go read any of these individuals. Not one of them should be given the indignity of being referred to as a pagan.
Especially when you read Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, the dialogue he has a Stoic dialogue with a priest and somewhat Platonist or something. And they're going, it's like a very, this book is so important to me because it highlights in the 1st century BC, it highlights that this conversation was being had about superstition. And Christianity gets credited for being the sort of step up from being superstitious, even though it's very superstitious too. Right? The Pope still comes out in January, and he checks this like gel or goo, and if it's solid, it means there's going to be bad omens, and if it's liquid, it's a good omen. Did you know about this? This still happens.
No.
This just happened in 2024 in January.
Oh my goodness!
Still do it. So the idea that they're not superstitious, but anyways, that's another topic. But Christianity gets credited as being like, we're not as superstitious as these other pagans are, and it's almost like, but that movement started before Christianity even was on anyone's tongue. Read Cicero. Read Even before, let's go back even farther. The pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, in one of
Yeah,
his fragments, Heraclitus has said these people are worshiping idols and talking to them like they're real. They don't know anything about the gods. So this that boat already sailed. That movement of like looking past superstitions and being more uh pragmatic about the divine, that's already a thing that's been 500 years in the making.
right. Yeah, in some ways, you could look at Christianity. I mean, there's nothing really new about Christianity. It's new in its configuration. It's new in that way that it's kind of like the automobile. We had engines, we had doors, we had windows, we had
Right.
steering wheels, we had all that stuff, and now it comes together a certain way. Not that Christianity was this great invention or anything. It's its own odd jumble of goods, but no, these weren't. This wasn't a new innovation. In fact, when it came onto the scene, it was considered a pernicious superstition.
Right.
That's how that was the natural reaction of people looking at it.
That's what
Yeah,
Kelsey said. Yeah.
yeah, and so dangerous, deadly. Even I think in Tacitus he refers to it as a deadly superstition. Um,
Right. Which is
and
so funny how they credit themselves as being the religion that got us away from all those superstitious pagans. But like
right,
you read the contemporary sources of the time period, and they're the ones getting called that. So it's obviously way more complicated than it's presented. Like in this very fairy tale like manner, is that this Christianity religion against all odds was, came up and just miraculously became the religion of the entire Roman society. But like you can see, it's way more complicated than that, and there's way more moving parts happening. And there's Platonism and Middle Platonism and philosophy involved behind the scenes, and a lot of these different early Christian sects, like the so-called Gnostics. When you read their text, it's very they're some of these sects. For example, the Carpocratians, they had images of Plato and Pythagoras next to Jesus. So you're seeing like all these different movements coming out of philosophical traditions influencing theology. So what I'm noticing is, as philosophy progresses, theology follows behind it. That's what it seems like is going on.
yeah.
Yeah, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that part of it is just the way people think, and so what are people doing? I mean, we're talking about the discourse at this point. Like, why isn't this being talked about? Why isn't this the in-depth exploration? The why isn't this the all-consuming or primarily consuming project for New Testament work? Why is what? Well, why are people? What is the New Testament in the mind and psyche of our culture at this time? It is a bridge, a possible bridge. It presents a hope that possibly something beyond the natural exists, some kind of extra thing that maybe we can survive death, maybe. And so people are looking to this religion in that way, and so it's theologically tethered. And so the discussion in that way, exploring, it's a lot of work. You want to, if you had to, as a New Testament, and this is kind of what I had to do. My work was transdisciplinary. I did like 3 master's degree programs, and I had to study classics. And I took all sorts of classics courses under classics secular professors all over the place. And as you'll see there, my book was basically a reworking of my dissertation. I had 3 of my 4 dissertation committee members were classicists. They could care less about the New Testament in so many ways. And so that's hard to get into their world and to become impressive in their world in terms of understanding, getting to a point where you can truly understand the classical Mediterranean world and all of its. I mean, in some ways, Judaism is by comparison appears, at least from my standpoint, like a tide pool compared sitting next to this vast sea that you have to learn and master and become immersed in
Right.
order to even feel like you understand what you're doing in that world. And so the more and more we do that, of course, the scandal is that it's not even like you would think people would put their flippers on and go swimming in that sea occasionally and at least make an effort, right? I mean, like I was talking to Derek the other day about Corinthians, first and second Corinthians. Well, Pausanias goes there and he walks around and looks at Corinth and gives a vivid description of that. I have classes at seminaries on the Corinthian correspondences. Pausanias, I don't even think was mentioned.
Right.
Not even mentioned. Like, what were we doing? I look back and I think, what were we even talking about? Like,
And by the way, he's a 2nd century geographer. Right.
right?
See, that's the perfect source. Like
Exactly.
there's your archaeology for the ancient world, like from the sources standpoint. Like you're right. He's walking around in the world that Christianity is growing in, middle 2nd century time. He goes to Corinth. He goes to all these different Ephesus, right? I'm pretty sure he went to Ephesus. But he's going all around the place, and he's describing what's going on here. By the way, speaking of Pausanias goes to a city. I forgot where it is. It's somewhere in central Greece, where they have a temple of Dionysus. And on the 5th of January, they take 3 jars of 3 empty jars, and they leave them out in the sanctuary. And in the morning, when they come in, they're filled with wine miraculously. Get this. The early Orthodox Church, this is I put this in one of my recent videos, and I'm still wondering why this isn't talked about. There are some scholars that wrote about this, and they're in the classics world, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But this is the early church, Orthodox Church, credits January 6th, the same day as the Epiphany, and the same day as the Magi gets celebrated on, and his birthday to some. You know how some Orthodoxy celebrates Christmas on January 6th. But they also say this is the same day of the wedding at Cana. Do you know this?
No.
So and this is Pausanias talks about this rite that they perform, where there's a miracle every year, and Pliny the Younger, 2 2nd century sources that mention this particular festival of Dionysus. And you have the wedding at Cana. And that's just one example. We talk about how in Resurrections, in Plutarch writes about this at length. You and I were talking about this recently. Plutarch starts naming off people who I don't even heard of, who supposedly died and their bodies disappeared, and they were assumed divinity because of this.
Yes.
What happens to Jesus? He dies, he gets put in a tomb, and he disappears, and he's assumed divine. That's a Mediterranean motif in general. Like we're talking about the resurrection itself. I just recently heard, and I love this scholar, Dan McClellan. I love Dan McClellan, but whenever he gets into like Greek influence on Christianity, he just rejects it all outright. He just can't. It's like he's allergic to it. And I heard him just recently say this. Some of the stuff, some of the Greek stuff that the Christians are modeling and using to write their text, but it has no influence on this Christian story or Christian tradition whatsoever. And I'm just thinking, the resurrection, the way the resurrection is described, is a Hellenistic motif that's all across the board. Romulus is an example.
Yeah, I've not read my book. That's the whole point and thrust of my book is to lay that out in vivid detail. That in fact the earliest Christians admit as much. They say this is what, and they interpret and receive that story in that way. That's why it's resurrection and reception. The reception of that story, the continuity. You could draw a through line from antiquity straight through Christianity into its later forms and see just how it evolved straight through that. And that's an anthropological kind of project. And New Testament scholars don't take anthropology. They don't even know what it is. They have no idea what that is.
And this is the sad part. Early Christians are willing to talk about that stuff more than scholars today. Justin Martyr, comparing Jesus to Hercules and Mithras and Dionysus and Mercury. He's throwing all these comparisons out there because he's trying to like talk to his fellow Platonists that are, that he wants to we're just like you guys. Not only that, Clement of Alexandria does this in his Protrepticus. You have what's his name? Shit, Epiphanius in the 5th century, when he writes the Panarion, he's talking about gods that are being celebrated as their birthday at the winter solstice.
Right.
He's comparing it to Jesus. Like, why? How come early Christians are willing to go and do this type of comparison, but scholars today who call themselves critical scholars don't want to go there?
Right, Justin Martyr. I mean, that's why I kick off my book with him, is because he's going there in spades. That's his he. In fact, he can't avoid that. Any argument outside of that wouldn't have gone anywhere in that world. And so he's having to go ahead and get honest about that. This is the bedrock upon which the resurrection story and so forth is. Today, there was a move. Like if you go back 100 years, a century, the scholarship was, at least in its best forms, moving pretty heavily into the classical Greek, Roman, Hellenistic study at that time to contextualize earliest Christian thought and texts. And so we see some of that, and we talked about Arthur Darby. He was about a century ago, exactly right now, actually, when he got his career going. He's a marvelous example of that. But what you see is that get pushed up the academic tower. And so you see in the elite schools, like Professor Chaniotis is one of the people that endorses my book on the back, teaches at the Center for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the same place Einstein taught. That's about as ivory tower as you can get. I mean, it's by invite only, and you get to study there if you've already earned your Ph.D. And they'll invite you, and they invite a couple people a year, and that's it, or every now and then. And so Bowersock was one of them. You might have heard of that name in the past. Another highly ivory tower type scholar that's super elite. So this conversation has been happening at that higher level, Harvard, some of these places, University of Chicago, Cambridge University. You'll see the discourse continue through. But when you get closer to where the culture's at, like say in seminaries,
right,
community schools,
SBL.
Yeah, there's a SBL for the most part. I mean, it's almost like a novelty to even hear from those people that are steeped in that and that are presenting it within that. Sort of
exist. Yeah. But this is what so I made a video recently about the Dionysian, not Dionysus Jesus connections, Dionysian connection. I think it's a better term, because I'm talking about like the culture of the Dionysus culture and the way they run their ecclesias. And Kloppenborg's written about this as well. And I was surprised because I started the video off with a joke. The video was an introduction. It was showing Dan McClellan refute an online TikToker on the Eucharist having any Dionysian influence. And I just made a joke and I threw him in there. And as I'm researching for this video and I'm writing my script and I'm looking for sources from scholars, there's so many that I couldn't use them all. There's so much scholarship on this subject. But what was so weird to me is when Dan McClellan talked about it, he was saying there's no scholars are talking about this. Like this is nothing. Nobody's ever written about this. I've never heard anything like this. This is nonsense. The way he said it. And then I just I'm looking up all these academic journals throughout the years. There's so much written about this, and it was like, does he just reject all this, or does he not know about this? Like, what's going on here? And I just think it's odd when you get a scholar who's very well accredited, like McCullen or Bart Ehrman. I'm throwing out names now. I'm gonna get in trouble. Oh well, who cares? It's no offense to Bart, but like he wrote an article and it's still up online. It's still not corrected, where he confuses Diogenes with Demetrius, and it's like, if we're not even getting names right. I mean, McClellan pronounced Semile's name Semele.
Semele.
Wait, so you're gonna stamp your foot down on the Dionysian aspects of Christianity if you don't even know how to say Semele? So how?
Right.
And all I'm saying is this: I love Bart Ehrman, I love Dan McClellan, I love all the stuff they do in New Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew stuff, all that stuff. But like, if you just sometimes you don't have to know everything. If you don't know something, just say I don't know. Say I've never heard anything like I never heard the Dionysian aspects of Jesus. This is new to me, but I'm sure there's someone who's written about. I don't know, but the way it was like the way it's shot down as if I know all this. Don't even look there. There's nothing to see here. Instead of being like, I'm not aware of it. That's all.
Well, it's for lack of training. If you think about it, I mean, I'm also an Erman fan, and he's got a number of insights that have been helpful, and in some ways we run parallel in certain regards. He went to Princeton Seminary, I did as well, but he's purely trained within the theological kind of training academy.
The Brute Metzger type of scholarship.
Yeah, this is the most conservative guy that's been at Princeton Seminary that I know of. I met him before he passed away. Super nice guy, but let's get honest. That does not amount to a secular training in ancient history. It was a theological training within the Presbyterian tradition that they offer there, and it is significant, and you do learn a lot there. But to say that that's going to then qualify you to speak on everything, within the broader classical Mediterranean world, I think that requires more study, and not that he's not capable of that, and not to even pick on Bart, but he's kind of a representation of a larger phenomenology within the field, where you've got these people that are trained at divinity schools and at seminaries all up and down, that are at least weighing in heavily to where the central thrust of the discourse are at, and what we're going to say is normal or mainstream or acceptable. And so this idea of dismissing out of hand whole categories of study,
it's a red flag.
that's not what would be going on if this were a secular, if this were ran as a secular topic and not a theological topic, but as a secular, where historians and literary scholars studying another topic within antiquity, that would not be going on at all. And so our field is in morbid isolation from the secular humanities. And so we're not playing by the same rules as the rest of the academic world. And I don't think we're as honest. And that's not to pick on any particular person. I had to fight my way out of that, all the way out to the end of my education, to get out of it, because I was trained at those same places. And I had to finally, for the last several years of my education, just, pleading to get at UCLA and all these different places, trying to get out of the divinity schools and get into the classics departments to learn everything I can about that ancient world. And so I think that's the problem, is that we're there. Also, it's a lot of work. It deconstructs the New Testament in so many ways. It's dangerous. We live in a society that doesn't want all of this overturned. This is the living religion.
I mean, in some ways, it's affecting, like, on a large scale, the war in Israel in a way, because people who support. I'm not going to get political right now, and I don't want you to either, but like, there are people who are influencing or supporting certain things happening in the world that are very detrimental to people due to religious belief.
It's absolutely the case. Yeah. And people hold this is sacred history. It's not just history, it's sacred history in the minds of so many people. It's not for me. For me, it's very interesting I could get as much out of reading about Apollonius of Tyana as I do about reading something out of Paul or some other place, or Plato's works. I could sit down if I want a personal kind of satisfaction or devotional kind of moment. I could read just about anything in the ancient world and just and find enrichment. But for most society, I'm unique that way. I don't see myself as normal in that, even though I ought to. I ought to see myself as normal in that way, because it really is. Yeah.
When you have people to get through seminary that have to sign a statement of faith, what you've done now, and this is something that still happens today in some of these seminaries, they have to sign a statement of faith to get their certificate or degree or whatever. And what you're doing is you're forcing them to lie no matter what. Either they have to lie for Jesus to promote Christianity, or they have to lie against the statement of faith that they just signed. Why? This is so horrible. Why is this even still happening? It's beyond beyond anything I can imagine. And this is what I mean about like some of these dogmatic attitudes that we find in some of these circles of biblical scholarship they do have like a major impact on the world and some of this stuff happening because of you're upholding, even if you're a critical scholar that rejects all miracles, but you're willing to just grant all the historicity parts. Like you see this with Bart a lot. Like if it says it in the story, if you can't prove it otherwise, it probably happened then. It's kind of like it seems like that's kind of like his attitude towards the text. Joseph probably was Jesus' father. Okay, whatever. Like we're like, what? I'm not saying I'm not even like saying he's wrong, but I'm saying like there's a lot of stuff that are assumed just to be true about the text, about the rise of Christianity, that otherwise you would think there should be more rigorous approach to this stuff. But then when it comes to like what we're talking about, when we're talking about the broader influences on this religion, now all of a sudden the burden of proof is higher and you need more. Like it's almost like, I don't know if I'm explaining this right. It's almost like certain things are accepted easily and other things are rejected and are not accepted as easy based on the sort of attitude of biblical scholarship itself. And I think that goes, and a lot of the more conservative side of biblical scholarship, they sort of push that forward, and it sort of gets, and even the liberal scholars sort of kind of go along with it. It seems like.
Well, yeah. Okay. So even the entire discourse is different in that regard. I mean, this whole conservative, liberal, and then I don't know what I'm supposed to be secular or we're just desperados off to the end of the discourse. Right. Really, I'm just practicing all of the tools that I've learned in the trade in terms of classical anybody that's trying to investigate and describe classical antiquity in a secular kind of context. That's what I'm bringing to this. I'm not trying to disturb anybody's faith necessarily or anything like that, but I do want to go back and give these texts the same dignity that we would afford them in any other topic, right? Yeah. And use the same measuring sticks, the same tools, the same methodologies,
we don't assume Socrates said all this stuff that Plato's making him say. We go, wait, Plato making Socrates say this? Is this something that fits the data? Let's compare it to what the other writer who writes about Socrates. We can compare them, how they present Socrates, and they're different. We're like, okay, is Plato making Socrates say this? Is he turning Socrates into this specific character? Why isn't that same approach happening to New Testament? Wait a minute, is the author making Jesus say this, or is this really? It seems like the approach on how much we give credence to the story in the New Testament is a lot different than what we would do in other aspects of different texts.
Well, it's the sociology of it all, and that's really kind of you talk to people that are out on the end of this, out on the edges, studying classics, and we are an odd bunch. We're kind of porcupines. You're talking to like Carrier or Litwa or Robin Faith Walsh is not a porcupine. She's a great example of somebody that tries to get along with everyone.
But she gets pushback too.
She does. And Dennis MacDonald is a wonderful man that's treated people very well throughout his career, but he gets treated horribly back by so many, even though his intellectual pedigree is hard to match.
Right.
Harvard trained all the way up the board. And so we're talking about somebody that's highly skilled and qualified to talk on these topics, and yet he's pushed to the margins. And so
the criticisms they get are not valid. They don't actually check and read the stuff that they're talking about. They just say, I've never heard that yet. That can't be right.
Right.
The seminary I went to, I never heard anything like that. That can't be true. That's bizarre. That's the sort of that's the sort of mentality that I'm noticing when it comes to the pushback against the Robin Faith Walshes and Dennis MacDonald's. It's almost like the pushback is just, nuh-uh,
It's fallacy. Yeah, the idea that I see this all the time online. I'll see people mention some of the people that you've listed in there, or myself, even in other contexts. It's well, that's not the mainstream view, or they're very no one, very few have embraced that theory or something like this, as
How many
if
times, how many times
that's
have
a
you heard people
fallacy.
say?
That's a fallacious kind of line of thought. Yeah,
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that's not the consensus. Okay, and is the consensus mean it's true?
right,
Let's look at the argument. Let's look at the text. Is this a plausible, even if you don't believe it, is it plausible? Let's start there.
right.
And at the very least, Dennis McDonald and Robin Faith Walsh, the stuff they're saying, beyond plausible. It's absolutely plausible. So like you can't even say it's not plausible, even if you think it's wrong. But the way they act like it's just like impossible. This can't be true. I never heard this. I was never trained this way. It's like it goes outside of the scope of this sort of mentality of New Testament scholarship.
My work is even given a worse treatment in some ways. I mean, I've had many. I mean, it's required reading at Harvard. Last time I checked, at least it used to be. And there are a number of places where it is taken very seriously, and in certain circles, especially in the high academies. But largely, it's seen as that I must be just off out into outer space doing my own thing. And really, what's going on there? I mean, I've if you look at it, so I'm doing mimesis criticism a lot like Dennis in some ways, but it's cultural rather than literary. That's my methodological lens throughout the book. And but also, what is the other thing? It's dismantling tacitly. Now, that wasn't my aim necessarily, but it's tacitly dismantling the reason anyone's even reading the New Testament to begin with, for the most part, and that is because of this hope for an afterlife or survival of death. And in some ways, if I'm correct in there all the way across, that particular perspective, and I am just to give you that confidence from my side, I am correct. That should be, and it was, the interpretation. That's how these texts were received originally. Um, then you have to concede that this was mythology or myth making in some way, and that it was that it was using the same cultic raw materials that were available at that time to build an early cult. They weren't trying to create a this really happened kind of movement. They were creating a cultic movement with cultic storytelling with the founder, and that was mythologized, as Pliny says in his text, that they were singing hymns to him as to a god, which was within that's the categories that they were able to conceive of this, and that was the very categories that it sprung up. And so um, if you think about that, that even biases it even one step further for me, where most of SPL could never accept my thesis out of hand. They don't even, before they even open the book.
Well, you want to know what? Want to know what it is? I think when somebody writes a book and they put it out there and it gets accepted and becomes a part of their identity. This is their.
Yeah.
But when you write something and it pushes up against some of their stuff, it's almost like they have to reject it because this is my identity they're dealing with. They're gonna make me look like a fraud. If he's right and I'm wrong, I'm a fraud. So you have like there's like monetary reasons behind it, not just monetary, but there's reasons why people automatically will shut down if you're saying something that goes against what they've been saying, and they're supposed to be the expert, and you're going against that. They're naturally gonna try to find ways to shut it down. You almost can't blame them.
If Dennis is right, I mean, going back to him, if he's right that Homeric and mimesis and other mimesis in the New Testament is rampant or even occurring at all a whole lot, then that means that almost pretty much every commentary that's been written up to this point in modern academic work on the New Testament needs to be pretty much probably thrown in the waste can. It's so far off at that point that we don't even know what we're doing. And so, and that's for people to admit that. Think about this. You go and you get your PhD, and then you come out the other end and you're presented with something that's so far outside of anything you were trained in.
Yeah. That's what I think is the main driving force behind the pushback. Is you get people who go to school for 8 to 10 years, they get a PhD in theology and religions, and then that whole entire time that they were in seminary and they learn what they learned, and they're being trained to only look at this area right here. Look at the
Right.
Dead Sea Scrolls, look at this, look at the Septuagint, look at the Old Testament, look at the Masoretic text. And that's their world. And then a couple of years down the road, they write some academic articles, they get their name out there, they're a real professional scholar now. All of a sudden somebody comes along and says something completely opposite, completely different. Imagine that. You'd be like, I've never heard anything like this. This can't be true. Because if it's true, I would have heard it in my years of going to seminary. Well,
Right.
sorry, but that's not the way it works. Either the data the data is there or it's not. So we need to start off, is what they're saying even plausible at first? If it is, then you should look at it.
That's right. That's what my whole my whole theory that I ran with in the book. That basically the translation fable. You really have to take a fresh run at it. I got to the point when I was writing it, I started, in my mind, I was having all of these arguments with all of the supposed leading scholars of our time that were New Testament folks. And I got to the point where it was just maddening. I just thought, you know what? That's a waste. None of them have studied Plutarch. They don't know any of this. They haven't studied this sufficiently. So for me to have this long, involved conversation with people that don't even know,
they're not even looking at it. They're just assuming that if their favorite scholar or the academics that they look up to, if they're not saying this, then it can't be true.
Right.
It's like this weird dogma. It's like this weird dogma. I think dogma is the best word to put it, because they're not actually engaging with the material. They're just engaging with it with well, I never heard that yet, so that can't be real. If this person doesn't agree, then I don't agree.
Right.
So I don't even have to read Plutarch. I'm not even going to read the passage that he's highlighting. I'm not even going to look at that Greek. I'm not even going to do this. I'm just going to assume that he's wrong because this person said he was wrong, and so did this person. And then it starts a whole domino effect. And next thing you know, you have a whole consensus of scholars saying that you're wrong. The consensus says that Richard Miller is wrong. I'm not saying this happened, but I'm saying that's what comes out of it. From one person just outright denying it, and that person being on top of a pyramid of scholars under that person, and they're all just going to follow suit. And that's just that. To me, it seems like that's what's happening a lot.
You become a symbol. I mean, people carry around in their minds usually these little caricatures and little cocktail napkin sketches of what somebody. If you go back and read Rudolf Bultmann, he doesn't look a lot like the cocktail napkin sketch of what people. He's kind of a boogeyman in so many religious training contexts. But if you go back and actually read him, it's not like. And the same thing with Dennis MacDonald. You go back and read him. I've talked to a number of people that rejected him out of hand, went and read his book, and then, oh, okay, yeah, this is compelling.
That's what I noticed. Some of these earlier scholars that have since been built upon, but also rejected. The Franz Kumantz of the Mithraic studies. You got James Fraser. You have. And then they get lumped. So these people, I'm not saying that these people are correct in everything they said. They said a lot of stuff that I would disagree with, but they get lumped in with the Dupuis and the really bad mythicist type stuff from the 18th, 19th centuries, early 20th centuries, and they just all get lumped in together. And but if you actually read Franz Kumant, most of the stuff he's putting down is legit. He's the greatest Mithraic scholar probably to ever live. And then James Fraser, he gets a lot of crap for some of the stuff that people just that's James Fraser type of stuff. What's so bad about James Fraser? I mean, yeah, his stuff's outdated. Yeah, it's older, but it's pretty good if you read it.
Right.
I won't say that about Dupuis. Dupuis, that book is trash. That book is horrible. He's just making stuff up out of thin air. So I do understand why there is some pushback against outdated material, but it almost seems, I don't know, that you get the point.
Yeah, I think that it's for lack of knowledge. It's kind of contempt prior to investigation. And also, what would it, if you've got people that are predicating their careers on their social kind of positioning within the larger topography of this field, this career, um, why hazard that by hitching your career to a bunch of work that potentially threatens your reputation, threatens your student reviews. It isolates you, or puts you off on the margins. You become a pariah. This kind of thing. Why do that? Well, the reason you do it is because you're supposed to be a scholar and not somebody that's playing a social game with your career. But unfortunately, that's mostly what's going on with this, because it is a social religion. There's heresy, there's orthodoxy, there's all of these different paradigms, and the winds that govern that, even within the larger thrust of Western academic history and ecclesiastical history, are determining a lot of this. Even the language that we use, like we went back to pagan, this idea of pagans. But there's so much more than that. What's biblical Greek? That's not.
Right.
It's not a category. It's not a thing.
Real. Right. Made up. There's no such thing.
Biblical lexicon. What is that? It doesn't exist. There's no such thing.
Right.
So we're drawing these lines, and a lot of that is coming out. We're inheriting that from a larger power discourse. Why are there even New Testament scholars at all? Why would there be this group that's certified to be able to speak on this topic, as if it were different than earliest? This is just earliest Christian literature. Why aren't these just early Christian scholars, or why aren't they just classicists? Why?
Right. It should be Mediterranean religions with like my main focus being New Testament or something.
Right.
You should have to know
Foucault.
Yeah.
It goes back to Foucault and the kind of the way the power lines that we draw, the power discourse, and the way that we divide up who gets to speak on what. And those are all arbitrary lines that don't have, they're actually bringing about violence and vandalizing the discussion. And they're not helpful. And so,
yeah, I mean, this has been a great conversation so far. I couldn't agree more. It's good to see that, like, because I can't determine if I'm correct and they're wrong. As someone who's not trained, and I've only been really like going at this for a few years, probably 3 to 4 years now, like really, really like very much like doing it on a regular basis every day, pretty much learning Greek, learning a little bit of Hebrew, reading the sources. And my main thing is more. I do read academic articles. I shouldn't say I don't, but I love to read the primary sources the most. Now, for me, I can't determine that I know things and they're wrong. I have to like, I have to assume that I could have holes in my own thinking, and maybe they're correct, and I just haven't gotten to where they're at yet. But when I see people like you and Dennis McDonald and Robin, just not even just classics departments and Egyptologists that have the same sort of. I was talking to an Egyptologist recently who was like mind blown that Christians don't talk about Hilaria more. Hilaria was a festival that was celebrated all across the Mediterranean around the winter, or at the time of the spring equinox, and it's a resurrection festival. It's like that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist. And this is all what I'm saying. Like that motif or that sort of influence could have had some influence on. I'm just saying, like, and this is what the Egyptologist was very humble about it. I'm saying, well, I'm not a New Testament scholar, so they probably have their reasons. But it just seems like to me, there's something going on here. And I'm thinking, imagine if you put that together with some of the stuff that people are learning in the New Testament, there might be something to look at here. I'm just an example.
I'll go ahead and say it. They are wrong. They should be studying these things. They ought to be out there and studying the heck out of it. If you're going to claim to be an expert in something, then you should go ahead and invest yourselves in immersing yourselves in the ancient thought world of where these texts got their traction, who were the, where were the communities at? These were the cultural hubs of the ancient classical Mediterranean world, the ancient Roman world. And
Yep.
yet, very few in our field really have anything approaching a vivid understanding of those contexts in any way, in any form. And so it's very rare, actually. And so that to me is embarrassing. It's embarrassing to the field, and that's why classicists don't show up to SBL. That's why literary scholars aren't showing up to SBL. That's why a lot of these Assyriologists, ancient Near Eastern studies folks aren't showing up to SBL a whole lot. Is because they don't see this as a safe as a normal place where they could set up shop and have discussions about the ancient world in any kind of honest context, because they're around people that aren't trained in that way. And so and it's a loaded topic. It's full of all sorts of people that are there. Most of the people at SBL are there because they're on some sort of religious pilgrimage, and that's why they got their education to begin with. And this is just where they happen to be, where it all got to at this point. And so that's not everyone, but that's a lot of it. And so that's not happening in any other field. No other field is described that way. And so I guess the closest you can get would be politics or something like that, where that's also highly loaded and charged
Yeah.
topic. But, I don't think there's anything else really that comes close to what's going on with this discourse. And so,
It's funny you said that, because if we were looking at religions in India, they're all on the same language, Sanskrit. They're in the same geographical location, and they have the same sort of similar stories going on. There's some overlap here. We'd be dissecting it and looking at stuff and comparing them all. But for some reason, in this region of Asia Minor and Thrace, where Constantinople is, where Byzantium was, we can't assume that the religions that precede Christianity in that region have any effect on the culture. We're just going to assume that they just rejected their ancestors' culture and started a new thing there. You would never do that anywhere else. It's only in this part of the world where we assume that this special religion is got a force field around it, and there's no influences from anywhere, even if it's the same geographical location, the same language, using the same motifs and imagery and symbolism and all that stuff.
Right. No, it goes beyond absurdity, really, if you think about it for much at all. And so I think that it's. I had to, when I wrote, I decided that I was going to write for a future generation where this was not the case. I had this kind of persona in my mind. How could my book be respected, like, say, in 50 years, if, like, say, we get past this and our field is more secular, it's more true to the humanities and the normal kind of processes that and rigor that you would put around any other topic. Then in that, yeah, and so I had to kind of try and aim for that as, future readers, when they read my work, will they find it true and honest and compelling and correct and helpful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I decided to target that as kind of my readership for the book. And that's a shame, because largely it has to do with, there's all sorts of reasons for that. SBL invites just about anyone to go and be participant. There's almost no constraints on anything that goes on there. And so I heard one fellow got up and gave a discussion on how true all the miracles. Now we know that the miracles in the New Testament really happened, and here's the proof of it. And he got a standing ovation.
Of course.
Yeah, standing ovation. And I thought, okay, well, first, that's not true, because my own training and study shows that this would have been part and parcel with other ancient miracle and mirabilia tales in the ancient world. And so first off, they're driving the conversation in a completely faith-interested direction. And secondly, in what other context, what other academic context It'd be like going to the British, the Royal Society, and having, their meeting, their annual meeting, and they're talking about King Arthur, and somebody gets up and talks about the historicity of Merlin or something like this, and everyone gives a standing ovation. It's really a bizarre time. It's an embarrassing time, and I think future generations will look back on us and see what we've done. We're funding the academic legitimation of our own mythosystem.
Right. And then, like I said, and that in turn plays a huge role in a lot of things that happen throughout the world. As a result, they're upholding some things that are affecting world events.
That's right. This is actually putting at risk the future. It's an existential threat by causal relation. It produces certain existential threats to our own species in some ways. To not have clarity on these issues is embarrassing.
Yep. Well said.
Yeah.
So I just want to throw out another link. There's links in the description for the book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. Any other projects you got coming up that you want to promote right now?
Well, I'm working on a book that has to do with the criminal aspects of earliest Christianity. Why are people getting thrown into prison and killed and so forth? Is it just because the Romans were monsters and all these trials were rigged and kangaroo trials and all that? Or were there actual laws being broken, and maybe even intentionally being broken? And so it complicates the picture in some ways of the innocent kind of birth of Christianity. But I think that's another one. My tendency is to look where no one else is going, the taboo topic, because that's where usually the treasure's at. That's where the insights are at that haven't been really explored yet, that really do balance out the picture and give it a lot more, make it a lot more true to the actual ancient world and the rise of the religion. And so that's something that I'm exploring right now. I'm reaching out to other scholars and maybe a joint project. And so if any of your viewers get excited about the topic, then have to reach out to me.
Sounds great. And once again, this was a great discussion. Thanks for coming on. And you have just attained true gnosis.